Bolt Action 3rd Edition is finally here, and with it comes many tweaks and new additions to the rule set that we all know and love. One of those changes is the way vehicle damage is handled. A whole new chart has been introduced for superficial damage rolls, and many of these results can stack on top of each other. While it is perfectly acceptable to keep a bunch of chits nearby to track these damage results, they can clutter up the table and degrade from the game's immersion. So, what's the solution? Could we instead model all of these damage results? Maybe on a single tank? Let's find out. Alright, if we're going to take a stab at modeling each damage result, we first need to choose our subject. Warlord's Caro Armado kit ended up fitting the bill quite nicely. It's small, but it has tracks that are separate from the road wheels, which will be handy later, and it will fit in nicely with my forthcoming full gore platoon for the Battle of El Alamein. So now that I've got my tank chosen, there's just one more thing I needed to do. Get a second one. I will be upfront, this project won't be a hobby hack, or really even that, practical? I just want to see if this idea can work. And I admit that I do enjoy role-playing as Uncle Night Shift every now and again. With all that out of the way, let's get started. Rolling a 1 on the superficial damage chart is the only result that affects the crew and not the vehicle. So let's take a look at the tank commander. The tank commanders included with the kit are a bit too small for my taste, so I opted instead to make my own from the Warlord Fallschirmjäger sprue. I chose this body specifically because the camo smock it sports is close enough to a tanker uniform. I cut away the lower half of the model and then glued on these arms with the intention of cutting them way down to fit with the hatches. In order to make the commander removable, I superglued a magnet to the underside of the hatch bucket and drilled a hole into the bottom of the torso. Into this hole I placed another magnet, which gave me a removable tank commander. I'm hoping my tank crew will not be stunned most of the time, so I grabbed the hatches from the second kit, glued them together to a piece of styrene, and then superglued them to 2 more magnets. At this point, I could glue on a Fallschirmjäger capped head, and then I attached the hatches to the arms, making sure they lined up with the holes in the turret. At this point, we have our tank commander ready, but he doesn't really communicate a crew stunned effect. Grabbing my pin vise, I drilled out a small hole in the top of his head. To go into this hole, I coiled up some wire into a halo of sorts. There's a good chance you are understandably confused at where this is going, but don't worry. I found these tiny confetti stars at a local hobby store for about $1, and one by one I superglued them around the halo, creating a slightly cartoonish, but very visible, stunned effect. Steering compromise takes away one of your pivots from advance and run orders, but communicating this visually was a bit of a challenge. After much deliberation, I settled on magnetizing the armored plate that covers the transmission and steering controls. To do this, I started by cutting 2 plastic rods to the width of the inner hull, which were then glued together with plastic cement. Once dry, I superglued 2 magnets to the rods, then attached 2 more magnetically on top. The idea was to wedge this structure into the hull, add superglue to the upper magnets, and press the armor plate into position. This way I could glue the plastic rods into the hull so the armor plate sat in the exact right position once magnetized. I then strengthened this structure with additional styrene and glue. The magnets on the armored plate were also strengthened with styrene, as these would get a lot of use. Now, I had an intact armor plate ready, but I needed to create the steering compromised effect. To do this, I grabbed the armored plate from the second kit and began gouging a hole in one of the transition hatches. Once that was complete, I added a magnet to this plate in the same way as I did the first. The final piece of the puzzle was the little bit of cotton smoke provided in all Warlord vehicle kits. I tore off a small piece, twisted the end, and threaded it through the painted armored plate. Then I could fix the smoke in place with superglue. turret jam was the most forgotten rule of 2nd edition, and so it was quite ironic to see it added as a superficial damage result when a 3 is rolled. I couldn't think of a way to represent this visually, so instead I settled on just jamming the turret. I fashioned a little jig that would catch on a styrene rod, and if this doesn't prove that I'm not a structural engineer, I don't know what will. This jig was fixed into the turret ring with a healthy dose of sprue goo. To stop the turret from rotating, I fashioned this bar with magnets on either end, then used it to superglue 2 magnets to the bottom of the hull. After the glue was dry, I could attach the bar magnetically, which would jam the turret. Having your engine damaged will assign the slow rule to your vehicle, and outside of physically moving my tank slower, I needed to figure out a way to make this visibly obvious. I decided to use the same smoke effect I had created for steering compromised. The engine cover piece has holes for 2 grills, and I decided to magnetize one side. I first drilled a hole through the grill before supergluing a magnet to the bottom. I then began building another styrene structure that would hold the opposite magnet. I used the magnet on the grill as a guide to make sure that it would sit in the exact right spot when attached magnetically. Gluing magnets haphazardly could result in crooked parts, and I definitely wanted to avoid that. I glued another magnet to a grill from the second kit, and once the parts were painted, I could once again thread some cotton through the hole I drilled earlier. I specifically chose the gray smoke so the effect would not be confused with the on-fire result, and voila! A roll of a 5 on the superficial damage chart results in your vehicle being immobilized. I figured the best way to model this effect was to have some interchangeable tracks. The return rollers on the running gear piece are already hollow, which made drilling them out a breeze. Once I had removed enough plastic, I could squeeze in a 3mm magnet. This step was repeated for each return roller, 3 in total. Once the superglue holding the magnets was solid, I dry fitted the running gear to the hull and slapped on some magnets to the opposite side of the hull wall. This gave my internal magnets perfect positioning so I could lock them into place with superglue. Moving on to the tracks, I held the bottom piece against the road wheels so I could mark the best spot to cut them. I wanted the broken section of track to be connected to at least 2 of the road wheels for a strong bond. Once I had my mark, I cut the track with my knife before gluing the larger section to the running gear. I followed the same process for the long section of track that is going over the return rollers, before cutting the piece, gluing it in place, and finishing the rear end of the track assembly. I had a lengthy bit of track remaining from the upper track piece I just cut, and this was going to represent where the track was broken. But in order for this to fit in place, I had to remove some of the plastic keying that was meant for the return rollers. To finish off the track, I used the curved track piece that was meant for the front of the running gear, trimmed a link or 2 away, and drooped it over one of the return rollers. At this point, I also decided to add some damage to the sprocket with my clippers before gluing it into place. I then needed to build the tracks for the other side, and this time I did it as the instructions intended. I also stole all the parts required to build a complete left running gear assembly, but I made sure to magnetize it in the same way I had done previously. And now I could swap out the 2 different tracks as needed. Roll a 6 on the superficial damage chart, and you are surely doomed. Well, maybe. Depends on how many pins you have and where your platoon commander is. The on-fire result is easily represented by those flame markers included in Warlord vehicle kits, but I wanted to take it to the next level. But in order to get to that next level, I had to take some preliminary steps. This came in the form of building up some magnets in the superstructure, so I could remove it from the hull when needed. You've probably seen the results of me working on this in earlier sections of this video. I also needed to cover this large hole in the back of the superstructure with plasticard, before I could turn my attention to the fire effect itself. I decided to use a flickering LED candle light I purchased from the dollar store, which was severely trimmed down so I could fit it inside the hull. Thankfully, it was made of some super cheap plastic. Once the LED was nice and snug, I turned my attention to the engine cover. I wanted the light bulb to be poking out of the engine cover, so I guesstimated whereabouts I needed to drill into the plastic piece, and went at it with my hand drill and then my power drill. Man, I really do need to get a rotary tool. So after using everything but the right tool for the job, I finally got the hole large enough to fit over the bulb and into place on the hull. After test fitting, I bonded the pieces together with super glue. The cool thing here was that the light fixture was large enough to fit into the hull snugly with friction, so no magnets needed. Well, at least not for the light. For those moments when the tank is not on fire, which I do hope is most of the time, I needed to fix an intact engine plate onto the rear of the hull. I accomplished this by supergluing two 3mm magnets to the back of the plate from the second kit. I then lined up the engine plate with the hull and the superstructure, and thanks to that plastic card sheet I added earlier, I could position two more magnets inside the superstructure to keep the engine plate in check. The final step was adding some smoke. I grabbed some teddy bear fur stuffing from my child's favorite toy and tore it into the correct size. I then hit it with some black spray paint to make it look a little more severe. Once the engine plate was painted, I added some super glue and white glue around the bulb and fixed the smoke over the light. And with that, the tank was complete. So at first glance, it may seem like one very normal, average Caro Armado tank, ready to take on anything the Allies have, as long as it's not facing anything more powerful than a Nerf dart. But should you manage to stun the crew? Damage the steering mechanism, jam the turret, cause engine issues, immobilize the tank, or set the poor vehicle on fire. One thing is for certain. My opponent and I will have no doubts to what the current state of the tank is. And I also did not forget about when the tank is destroyed. I cut down another LED light so that it could fit into the superstructure, sans turret of course. I honestly could not be happier with how this project turned out. This little tank kit is surprisingly friendly to magnetizing and modifications, and while I'm not blind to the fact that this is a rather impractical approach to marking damage on vehicles, you could use most of these same techniques to magnetize the Semivente superstructure that is also included in the kit, so that you could run either tank. While I may like cosplaying as Uncle Night Shift when I'm modifying tank kits like this, I certainly don't feel like him when it comes to actually painting the tank. This was my first ever desert vehicle, and even though I added some dust effect enamel washes, I don't feel like it really communicates that it is operating in the desert. Maybe I'll give pigments a go on the next Italian vehicle. Anyways, thank you so much for making it this far into the video. If you enjoy these types of videos and want to see me tackle more wild projects for Bolt Action, please make sure to like this video and subscribe to the channel. It really does help out greatly. Also, leave a comment on what I should work on next. I'm always open for conversion quickie ideas, but I also like exploring some of the more philosophical topics related to Bolt Action, such as tabletop standard and scale. Thanks again, and we'll see you next time.
Keep it dry.
Of like, sure, you can have all these chits, but they clutter the table and they break from immersion. So what if we just, or you just waste your life and 80 magnets and you magnetize it.
You could spend a week of sleepless nights in order to fully magnetize and
Just ignore your family, your wife and children, and build a model.